Okay, then it's 12:32 Hong Kong time. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining this webinar. My name is Andre Mudigdo, Senior Wealth Advisor with Oreana Private Wealth. And again, thank you very much for attending this webinar. This time, the topic revolves around moving to Australia, visa and planning considerations. We're very lucky to have our two presenters today to give us a bit of an insight of what you need to consider in considering the move to Australia in terms of any visas or any financial planning considerations. Our two presenters today will be Jennifer Wood, owner and director of AusVisa Link Private Limited, as well as Matthew Jones, a senior wealth advisor with Oreana Private. Before I introduce the two speakers, just a few housekeeping matters. I no doubt there will be some questions that you might have during the presentation. Please use the Q&A button for questions you'd like the presenter to answer. We have actually set aside some time at the end for us to attend to those, time permitting, and so we can just hopefully have a good discussion at that stage. In terms of the chat, it'll be switched off for a better attendee experience. And please, if you can remember to put yourselves on mute, that'll be quite appreciated. So on to the speakers. Jennifer Wood is an Australian registered migration agent and the owner-director of AusVisa Link Private Limited. She's been working in the Australian migration space since 2010, where she's worked previously as an officer for the Department of Home Affairs in Australia. She also has working stints in the UAE and Pakistan before becoming a registered migration agent. She holds a Bachelor of Justice from Queensland University of Technology and a postgrad diploma in migration law from the ANU. Currently, she resides and works in Australia, but she has previously lived and worked in Japan, US, Spain, and the UAE. She specializes in partner, skilled, child, parent, resident return, employer-sponsored, and visitors visas for Australia. So very comprehensive expertise, if you like, in this particular space. She does, with her experience as well and her experience abroad, she does understand the need of those living in Australia and expatriates as well. The second presenter will be Matthew Jones. Matty is a senior wealth advisor at Oreana Private Wealth. He focuses on providing financial planning, investment advice, and cross-border tax solutions for Australian expats living and working in Asia. He specializes also in delivering comprehensive financial advice for families and individuals looking to relocate to Australia. Dual license in Australia and in Hong Kong, he provides a goals-focused strategic advice approach for clients in all circumstances, offshore and onshore. He has 10 years experience in financial services and has been with Oreana since 2017. Authorized under Australia's financial services license to provide advice on Australian products. He's also accredited with Hong Kong's SFC license to provide financial advice in Hong Kong. So it's dual, he has a dual capability, if you like, in providing advice in those two jurisdictions. So without any further ado, I'll hand you over to Jennifer to start the presentation.
Thank you, Andre. I'm just going to share my screen. Just bear with me. Andre, it looks like I may not be able to whilst...
That's all right. I'll be able to click for you if that's okay, Jen.
That would be fantastic if you could. Yep. Thank you. I really appreciate it. Okay, well, look, thank you obviously for the introduction, Andre. Really appreciate you doing that for me today. And thank you to everyone for also joining us today and taking time out of your day to hear about migration and repatriation options. It is obviously my pleasure to work through that information with you. As Andre mentioned, I'm a registered migration agent for Australia, which is why I can provide you with legal migration advice. Today's advice will be general advice only. However, you are welcome to contact Matt and myself if you do have any specific inquiries or interest in Australian migration, which we don't cover today. My hope for today's webinar is really that you'll hear more about Australian migration and repatriation options, and that this information is useful in making some informed decisions, particularly if you are considering making that onward move to Australia more immediately or in the future. Next slide. Okay. So in terms of what we'll be covering today, obviously, if any of you are aware of Australian migration, you'd know that it's not only complex, but it's also incredibly diverse. Try and cover as much as I can, but ultimately we are pressed for time. But I will be covering Australia's current migration program for the 2022-23 program year. The Australian migration program years actually follow the Australian financial year, so the 1st of July through to the 30th of June. We'll also be looking more broadly at the visa pathways available for Australia and some of the common visa subclasses and visa streams that I'm seeing coming out of Hong Kong, either from Hong Kong nationals or Australian expats, and also, in terms of global citizens as well. Big topic for most people is home affairs processing arrangements and how that actually operationally works. For me personally, I've worked in that environment, so I can give you some on-hand advice. Australian citizenship is always very interesting to discuss, and also why you might want to engage a migration professional to help you on your migration journey. Next slide. Okay. So in terms of the Australian borders, as many of you would know, we were closed from March 2020 through to February 2022. It was a hugely difficult time for a lot of Australian citizens and permanent residents, particularly those who are stuck abroad. We are so thrilled that the Australian borders are now open, because it means that you all can come back in and out of Australia as much as you please. But it's also opened up Australian migration, which had really seen quite a slump over the 2021-22 year. In terms of the migration planning levels for Australia, they really are focused around making sure that Australian families can relocate back to Australia, but also in terms of looking at how we can improve the economic situation in Australia and recovering from the COVID pandemic, which really left us without a lot of skilled migrants as the borders were closed and skilled migration was at a standstill. So the increase in migration planning levels for the 2022-2023 year have actually jumped significantly. So we've seen, the 2021 to 2022 year, that skilled migration was around 79,000 places, so visa places were on offer, to well over 110,000 places which are on offer this year. So whilst this may not be really relevant to Australian citizens and permanent residents, it is really relevant to those who are living abroad, who are skilled migrants and wanting to make a move to Australia and certainly explore those options. The Australian unemployment rate as of July this year was around 3.4%, which, to be honest, is the lowest it's been in nearly half a century. So it certainly has improved, and a lot of Australian citizens and permanent residents have been able to fill a lot of the spaces that we were lacking in the Australian labour market. But that certainly has then shown that there are still several areas within the labour market which need to be filled by skilled migrants. So skilled migration is really on the rise in Australia. So as I said, while this may not be relevant to you if you are Australian citizen or permanent resident, it certainly may be relevant to somebody that you know who's in Hong Kong or abroad, who's looking at making the move to Australia. Skilled migration really comprises of quite a few visa streams. It includes employer-sponsored, where you'd actually need an employer to sponsor you to make that move to Australia and to be part of the visa process with you. General skilled migration, which is assessed on your own merits, so your qualifications and your skill set, business and innovation, as well as investment, and of course the global and distinguished talent visas. The family visa subclasses are really based around somebody who has an Australian citizen or permanent resident partner, or I guess like parent as well. Most of those visas are really around parent, child, and other family. And then, of course, you've got your special eligibility visas. So as you can see, Australian migration is really complex, so many streams. We might move to the next slide because I'll actually talk about how many visas there are in Australia. Look, anybody can go onto the Home Affairs website. There is quite in-depth information regarding the types of visas that you might be able to apply for Australia. But in all senses, there's only 60 visas currently on offer for Australia. These visas can be temporary, provisional, or permanent visas. And within these visa streams are actually subclasses of visas as well. So ultimately, the major overarching pathways are your visitor visa streams. So people who aren't Australian citizens or permanent residents, employer-sponsored, study, skilled, family, business, investment, and refugee and humanitarian visas. The visas are actually coded by numbers. So I'm sure if anyone has actually looked through the Home Affairs website or even done some Googling, been in forums, you'll actually see people refer often to visas by their numbers. And that can get pretty confusing, particularly where you have some visas which are part of a combined visa subclass. Partner is actually a really good example of that because you are actually applying for two visas within the same application and they are coded differently. You can move on to the next slide. Okay. So obviously many of you would be coming out of Hong Kong, whether you're Australian citizens or permanent residents. There's also people who aren't, and they are Hong Kong citizens or expatriates abroad. They may be looking for a move onwards to Australia. And in terms of looking at someone who's not an Australian citizen or permanent resident, we'd be looking at some of those employer-sponsored pathways, your general skilled migration, potentially looking at partner visas as well if you are married to an Australian citizen or permanent resident or in a de facto relationship. But look, if I turn to a different angle here and I look at people who are actually in Hong Kong nationals or British national overseas passport holders, there actually are a number of visa pathways that have been opened up by the Australian government for these people, mindful of what's going on in Hong Kong and the need for people to have an onward pathway, particularly if they don't see themselves being permanently resident or remaining in Hong Kong for the foreseeable future. So there are a number of temporary and also permanent visa pathways which have opened up to Hong Kong citizens and British national overseas passport holders, and predominantly around that student and skilled migration pathways. So that's where they're actually completing eligible tertiary studies in Australia, or they've actually held an employed sponsor visa in Australia and are looking for a permanent visa pathway. In March this year, the Australian government actually opened up a number of different visa streams too, in fact, which are permanent visa streams for Hong Kong nationals who are looking to make Australia their home. They coded the subclass 191, which is a regional skilled visa, permanent resident visa, and also a subclass 189 Hong Kong stream skilled visa. So if anyone's looking to get some information on those visas, please feel free to contact me. They are certainly great visas to have, because with permanent residency then comes Australian passport, which would be really useful to a lot of Hong Kong nationals who are looking to make Australia their home for the foreseeable future. But in terms of the other kind of visas that are coming out of Hong Kong, as in people who are interested in different types of visas, we have a lot of family visas. So the number of partner visas I've processed or actually gone ahead and lodged over the past couple of years has been astronomical. I think there was a lot of people who were abroad who really didn't anticipate having to move back to Australia more immediately. COVID certainly put a spanner in the works there, and the number of people who had to get back to Australia more immediately was huge, which was really complex. And Matt, you would have seen that in terms of trying to financially plan for some of your clients as well, with a move that they really didn't anticipate, but having to do it more immediately. With visas for Australia, nothing works quickly. And I think, if you are thinking about making the move back to Australia, COVID has really shown us that you need to migration plan, and you need to do it in advance, because otherwise you are going to leave yourself short of time. And, thankfully, Australia is not going to be shutting their borders anytime soon, but we all don't know what's happening in the future as well. And it's important to have all your ducks in a row, essentially. And that's what I talk to a lot of my clients about. So the visa pathways in terms of family, it's partner, child, adoption. Adoption's a big one. I see a lot of adoption visas come out of the region, as well as resident returns. So parties who have had permanent resident visas for Australia before actually looking to re-enliven or reactivate their permanent residence and move back to Australia. Of course, we've got the skilled migration and business investment and investment visas as well. Okay, this is a huge question that I always get, is how long does a visa take for Australia? Why couldn't I have had it yesterday? Well, unfortunately, and fortunately, the Australian government actually sees a lot of visa applications, significant amounts throughout the globe of people wanting to migrate to Australia, and they have actually increased significantly so in the last couple of years. Home Affairs actually does have offices overseas, as many of you would well know, consulates, embassies, and they also do visa processing in Australia. There is a processing website, which I've actually just provided there. So that's advertised by Home Affairs, where you can actually look up your visa subclass if you've already lodged or you're looking to lodge, to see how long it will take to get that visa. These are global processing times. And really, as I mentioned there, it's about trying to manage expectations. So if Home Affairs is able to advertise, generally, this is how long a visa is taking to process, then it will help you manage leading up to your migration to Australia, how long you may need to leave in advance to do that. In terms of the processing, though, it does differ between offices. So I've processed visas with Home Affairs in Australia, and I've also processed visas overseas in an offshore diplomatic office. And depending on the number of visas that you come through on the pipeline will really depend on how long the visa is going to take. So some offices take longer than others. I'll be honest, I've actually processed, lodged a lot of visas through the Hong Kong office for Home Affairs, and their processing time appears to be quite long compared to other offices. But that may have just been in recognition of the fact that, for quite a few years now, we've been working on skeleton staff. The visas have been processed in any number of offices abroad, but also back in Australia as well. So whilst you may see on forums that somebody has got their visa in 2 weeks, that doesn't necessarily mean that's going to be the case for you. Your processing time could be a lot longer. So it's important to know that visas are processed on their own merits and case by case. So there's obviously legislation and policy guidance which aids a delegate, a case officer, to work through the application. Really, you are at the mercy of whoever picks up your application, electronically, of course, and works through your application to get to a finalisation. If there's information that's missing, it's only going to delay your process. So if you can front-end load applications, make sure that you're lodging decision-ready applications, that's certainly going to reduce the delay in any kind of finalisation of that application. Okay, partner visas. This is my wheelhouse. This is what I do every single day. And that's not to say that it's an easy visa. Certainly, whenever I meet a couple or a client sponsors, what have you, I see it as this is a new couple that I'm meeting and their story is very unique. And I think that's the basis of a partner visa, is that you need to satisfy a delegate that you are in a genuine and continuing relationship, and it's beyond the visa process. Many of you would have looked into this process already, but I'll go through it very briefly. You would have seen that there are onshore and offshore partner visas. Now, really, the visa that you should be applying for is where you are at the time of application. So if you are offshore, you would apply for a subclass 309-100 partner visa. And if you are in Australia, you would apply for a subclass 820-801. Now, if you do need to move to Australia more immediately and you do have access of a visitor visa, then you can go to Australia on a visitor visa and apply for the partner visa onshore. So there are a couple of different options there, and that's why it's really important to get some migration advice before you launch into that process, particularly with the cost of this visa, to make sure that you're actually applying for the right visa in terms of your circumstance. The visa itself is a combined visa application, which means that you are applying for 2 visas in the one application, which is probably why it's so expensive as well. But at the end of the day, you know that you're not going to have to apply for another visa once you've actually made this application. It's an indefinite permanent resident visa for Australia. It has a 5-year travel facility attached to it as well. So that's from when the permanent visa is granted. Many people who approach me actually can be assessed for the provisional and the permanent visa up front. And that's because they meet the long-term provisions, which is that you have been in the relationship for 3 years prior to application or 2 years with the birth of a child. So please know that operationally, how that works is that the delegate will go ahead and grant the provisional visa and then immediately turn their mind to, well, does this person also meet the permanent grant? If that's the case, you will see 2 grants coming through at the same time. The permanent resident visa overrides the provisional visa, and that's when the 5-year travel facility starts, and that's from the date of grant. This is a great visa because it allows you to travel into and out of Australia. You can remain in Australia. You can also live abroad holding a partner visa, and many people do. You can access the Australian Medicare system once you are in Australia. Would probably not access Medicare if you are usually resident offshore and your partner is a non-resident for tax purposes, but this is more Matt's wheelhouse. You can also study in Australia as well. So holding a permanent resident visa means that you can access the local rates for university if that's what you plan to do. You can include secondary applicants, so where you have a partner who has children from another relationship, so long as they are intending to be in the full-time care of that primary applicant, then you can include those secondary applicants, which is great. Fortunately, you can't include parents anymore. You used to be able to, but they did stop doing that some time ago. You do require a valid marriage or be in a de facto relationship. For migration purposes, you need to be in a de facto relationship, so living together for 12 months prior to application. There is a way around that, and that would be if you were living, one party was living in Australia where they could actually register the relationship with the state registry for births, deaths, and marriages. That's a really good question to ask a migration agent if you are concerned about whether your de facto relationship meets the requirements, particularly before you launch into the process. You will still need to evidence other aspects of your relationship, so the financial aspects, household, social, and commitment. This is all pretty subjective. So every relationship is different, and you may not be able to evidence all aspects, but cumulatively, you should be able to satisfy the delegate, so the case officer deciding your matter, that a genuine relationship does exist. The cost is astronomical and it keeps climbing. It is currently $8,085, and the processing is really up to 36 months. That's not my experience. That's what's advertised. I would say that most partner visas are coming through anywhere up to around 18 months at this point in time. Onshore is a little bit faster right now. I'd say probably anywhere between 6 to 12 months, if not sooner. Again, you may read plenty of forums that say, you know, I got my visa in a week. Others might say they got it in 3 years. So you really need to kind of manage expectations there, but make sure that you have complete applications that are lodged with Home Affairs. If you do lodge it yourself, make sure that you lodge it with evidence. Because if a delegate does pick up the application and there's no evidence, they will send you a request for further information, generally only one. And if that's not addressed, then the application may be subject to refusal. That's a lot of money to lose. So I would really encourage you to make sure that you do evidence your applications as much as you can. Resident return visa. This seems to be a really complex visa, and a lot of people don't understand a lot about it. It's pretty complex for a migration professional as well, because every situation is quite different. Really, the purpose of the visa is for somebody who has been a permanent resident visa holder or is continuing to be a permanent resident visa holder, but is really looking to move back to Australia. A lot of people don't realise that once you get a 5-year travel facility on a permanent resident visa, that lapses after the 5 years, at which point you need to make some decisions. It's not that you need to move back to Australia permanently, it's that you need to make a decision as to when you will be moving back. And if you are looking at moving back more permanently, you would renew that travel facility through lodging a resident return visa, which is a subclass 155. The other option is that you move back before the travel facility expires on your permanent resident visa, at which point you would only need a resident return visa if you were looking to make a departure outside of Australia and wanting to return as a permanent resident, which I would encourage you to do. And then the other option is to just let your permanent resident travel facility completely lapse and only reapply for the resident return visa to re-enliven your permanent residency, so that you can re-enter Australia as a permanent resident and then take on all of the rights and responsibilities at that point. A lot of people do get pretty nervous about allowing a permanent resident travel facility to lapse, but ultimately I've had plenty of clients who have gone ahead and re-enlivened their travel facility, even though they haven't lived in Australia, and they've continued to travel to Australia on visitor visas. The only downfall of that is that if you are looking to acquire Australian citizenship, you will need to make sure that you meet the residence requirements. And one of those is that you are a permanent resident for at least 12 months prior to applying for Australian citizenship. The other is that you spend a cumulative period of 4 years living in Australia. So these are usually granted, the resident return visas, for a period of 5 years or 12 months. Usually, if you have met a 2 out of 5 year stay in Australia, you would be granted an RRV with a replenishment of 5 years. If you don't, however, meet that 2 out of 5 years, you would only be granted 12-month replenishment of travel facility. And look, you can continue to renew RRVs every single year until you meet the 2 out of 5 years. But at some point, the Australian government is going to say to you, if you're overseas, are you actually going to be moving back to Australia? If not, we will not grant the resident return visa. Reapply when you are ready to move back to Australia. The cost is pretty small. It's 425 Australian dollars, and the processing is up to 3 months. I would really encourage you, if you have never applied for a resident return visa and you are coming up to the end of a 5-year travel facility on a permanent resident visa, to touch base with a migration professional. I'm not a hard sell, but for the first one, at least make sure you get some advice, because if you don't meet the 2 out of 5 years, you will have to evidence that you have personal, cultural, or business ties to Australia, and they have to be substantial. Purchasing a home in Australia is not the only thing that you can do. There are other requirements or other areas that you can show those substantial ties, but it's not as straightforward as what a lot of people may assume. Okay, parent visas. This has become such a hugely, I guess like a lot of people are applying for parent visas because during COVID, family became really important, like hugely important. And when you had travel restrictions, you know, a lot of people found themselves really missing family and wanting to bring them closer. So Australia does have a number of parent visas on offer. And look, they're probably some of the most complex visas, to be honest, because there are just so many to choose from. With that said, they are a great visa to hold for a parent because they can have permanent residency in Australia and they can still continue to live abroad as well. It's just for some parents, as in grandparents, for example, they may actually wish to relocate to be with their family in Australia. The way that you would approach this is that you are eligible to have a parent visa if you have more children actually residing in Australia than out, and that child is actually permanently resident in Australia. They have to either be an Australian citizen or an Australian permanent resident. There are two different types of parent visas, and they fall in, well, there's quite a few of them, but there are contributory and non-contributory. So contributory parent visas are incredibly expensive, but they are shorter processing time. It's a faster pathway to permanent residence. And if you are looking for an Australian passport, this is a great option. And the non-contributory, look, I do plenty of non-contributory parent visas. It's actually really helpful for parties who have an ability to enter Australia on a visitor visa, and they're happy to remain on a bridging visa in Australia with the view of never getting a parent visa, but actually paying a lesser amount for a parent visa as opposed to that contributory parent. As I said, really confusing visas, but I'm happy to walk through any of those visas with you. They're actually broken up into two visa application charges, and you can see them there that generally the first application charge is that around $4,355, and the second visa application charge can be anywhere between $2,000 to the $43,600. Why is it so expensive for that second visa application charge for a contributory parent? Well, it actually is mindful that there's a Medicare incentive there. So if, for example, somebody is wanting to migrate to Australia on a parent visa and they would like to access the Medicare system, they would go for a contributory parent visa because that would be available to them after the visa is granted. So it's actually currently 67 months as opposed to 30 years. If you apply for a non-contributory parent visa, the likelihood of you getting the parent visa is slim to none. So it's about remaining in Australia on a bridging visa. Hugely confusing, I know, but it's certainly an option. I find a lot of British parents seem to take that option. Australian citizenship, as it says there are actually three ways of obtaining Australian citizenship. So by descent, plenty of Australian citizen babies born overseas, they would go ahead and apply for Australian citizenship by descent. Super easy to do. You can do it online through the IMI account. You just need to have one Australian citizen parent. And yeah, vaguely they come through within a couple of months actually. Australian citizenship by conferral is where you would actually have an Australian permanent resident visa. You would satisfy the 4 years continuous residence in Australia, and that you would have no more than 365 days absent from Australia and no more than 90 days within those 4 years absent from Australia out of the 4 years. And then acquisition is completely different as well. So there is a residence requirement. We just discussed it. You will still need to meet character requirements. And there is obviously pledge and an Australian citizenship test, not for citizenship by descent, but for conferral. The cost is anywhere between $300 to $490, which is actually very cheap compared to a lot of other citizenship requirements abroad. And I would say, you know, comparatively to say somewhere like the UK, Australian citizenship is relatively straightforward. And it's a lot faster to get than the British, say, partner visa that leads on to a citizenship. Processing time is anywhere up to 23 months. But look, Australian passport is an incredibly strong passport to have. So for those of you who are looking to obtain a permanent resident visa with the view of getting an Australian passport, that's a great option. Australia does actually acknowledge multiple citizenships, so you can actually hold many passports. You just need to enter and depart Australia on an Australian passport. You can use your other passports anywhere else in the globe. I'm not sure actually, Matt, like in terms of Hong Kong, if you did hold a Hong Kong passport and you acquired Australian, I think, can you use both of them?
Potentially, yeah, I think so.
Kind of putting you on the spot there, sorry. But I know, look, there are some countries where you actually can't hold two passports, so that would be a decision that you would have to make. You can continue to hold Australian permanent resident visa indefinitely. You aren't required to get Australian citizenship, but just know that it is an option if that's what you are looking for. And then finally, engaging a migration professional. This is a really good question. Why would you want to engage a migration professional? One, particularly when it comes to challenging visa streams, you do need to understand the migration legislation and requirements. Just to give you a simple example here, I remember about a year ago, a couple actually approached me from the UAE, and the sponsor had thought that they were actually an eligible New Zealand citizen, not just a New Zealand citizen, but an eligible New Zealand citizen, lodged an Australian partner visa incorrectly. They should have lodged another type of visa, and they actually lost the $8,085. So, you know, in consulting with a migration professional, it actually would have alleviated all of that. They would have paid less money for the other type of visa, and they wouldn't have had to go through the process again. It definitely ensures that you apply for the right visa in that case as well. Any good agent will go ahead and put together your applications, all of your forms. That will lodge the application for you, make sure that the evidence that you're providing is correct and compelling. They will monitor and manage your application to finalisation and really act as your spokesperson with Home Affairs. Believe it or not, Home Affairs is getting into a practice of sending quite a few requests for further information and for really interesting requests. So having an agent on board or a migration professional allows you to have that level of confidence that somebody is actually going into bat for you and that you're going to get the best decision or the right decision for your circumstances. It also, you know, allows you to have that level of advocacy as well. I certainly have had to put back to Home Affairs a number of times like that. They hadn't actually reviewed information, or the information that they were requesting wasn't actually even part of the visa subclass or wasn't required as part of the evidence requirements. So that's certainly helpful to have, because it will then allow the application to be pushed forward for finalisation. It also takes the stress out of migrating back to Australia. I've been an expat, my husband's an expat, and I know moving or relocating back to Australia was not an easy process. It was certainly a massive decision for us. And so having a migration professional on board is really going to allow you to get the process done in the quickest possible time. And that, you know, it's a streamlined process for you, so you can really focus on the other elements that you need to in your life to wrap up your time wherever you are, and then look forward to making that planned move to Australia. So as I said, I'm not a hard sell, but it would be a pleasure to help any of you in terms of migration to Australia. So please do feel free to contact me.
Okay, thanks for that, Jen. Again, if you have any questions for Jennifer, please feel free to include them in the question and answer, and we'll definitely try to attend to them, time permitting. Now, Maddie will actually go through some of the financial considerations of moving to Australia. As There are quite a few of them. So over to you, Matt. Would you like me to stop sharing the screen?
Yeah, sure. I can bring mine up. Okay. Yeah, so thanks, Jennifer. Look, having experienced this process with clients from a professional aspect and I guess personally as well, with Jennifer, it is a complex process, and having that professional to guide you through and I guess give you that peace of mind that you're spending your money wisely, and you're not going to have issues with such an important subject for those thinking of moving to Australia. So hoping to, I guess, complement this session quite well from financial planning aspect. I'll be going through the things you need to think about. In particular, I'll be focusing a lot on tax. I'm sure a lot of people on the line are quite aware of the relatively higher tax rates of Australia compared to, particularly compared to Asia and Hong Kong. So I'll be going through some of the ways, some of the things to be aware of, and also some of the loopholes and or traps to be aware of, and also some of the strategies. So firstly here, just going to go through a bit of a checklist before leaving. So assuming you've got that PR or citizenship and now you're looking to move or relocate to Australia. So before leaving, there are a lot of sort of key tips here to save you some pain and particularly mitigate or save you some tax surprises as well. So the first one being obviously obtaining valuations before leaving the country and moving to Australia. So real estate in particular, obtaining valuations so that capital gains tax can be apportioned accurately. This is crucial for both Australian property, but also overseas property as well, given that overseas property, the cost base can actually reset when you become an Australian tax resident. With liquid assets, considering crystallising these or reviewing strategies to structure more tax efficiently, depending on the assets and your situation. Consider winding up any offshore trusts and structures, including offshore companies. This may be inefficient from an Australian tax perspective. So this also includes MPF and retirement schemes as well that are considered foreign trusts by the ATO, not necessarily foreign super. So again, not falling into that trap that MPFs, CPFs also are considered foreign super and receive tax exemptions in Australia, because they typically don't. So they're just considering more tax efficient structures that may be available, looking at either onshore or offshore trust, superannuation, or taking advantage of opportunities to consider prior to moving to Australia or repatriating back for expats. So receiving payments such as bonuses and termination payments prior to repatriation, particularly if you're on a more a relatively lower tax jurisdiction than Australia. Employee share plan considerations as well. So gains can be taxed at departure in some jurisdictions, tax jurisdictions. So best to review your entitlements. This is actually particularly an important one for Singapore. There's a bit of a trap there to be aware of. Settling final tax clearances as well. So with the relevant tax departments, ensuring your tax returns are all settled to avoid any delays in receiving potential final salary payments. And obviously just ensuring that you're getting the best rates on currency exchanges and timing rightly there as well. So after arriving in Australia, really important to review your superannuation contribution strategy for tax efficiency. Worldwide tax. Australia has worldwide tax, which means that both capital gains and income generated not just in Australia, but overseas as well, once you're an Australian tax resident, will be taxed at those higher tax rates. So reviewing your overall strategy is important. And also potentially your investment strategy as well. So for instance, franking credits, as an Australian tax resident, that can be very beneficial. So you may want to review any existing portfolios that you may have to ensure that's appropriate for the Australian tax system that you'll now be subject to moving forward. Reviewing lending arrangements, again, that's a good one. You can actually, we actually probably should look at this before moving as well if you're considering borrowing, as you can often get potentially better lending deals. Given if you're on a higher tax income and a higher net income and potentially less tax outcomes. So I guess although you're moving back to Australia again, if you're considering moving into an investment property, for instance, which will now be your home, the tax deductibility changes on any mortgages associated with that. So important to review that and consider potentially refinancing or a debt recycle strategy to ensure that your debt is working tax efficiently for you. Applying for Medicare and arranging private healthcare is also important as well. So I guess now pretty much all Australians need private health cover if you want to avoid the Medicare levy surcharge, which is basically just an additional tax now for higher income earners. It was introduced to take some of the pressure off the public system. And also with regards to private health cover, better to take this out when you arrive earlier rather than later to ensure that you avoid the annual lifetime health cover loading as well that can be applicable to this every year. And then just also looking at your general insurance, home, vehicles, etc., and making sure that they're all in place appropriately. So understanding Australian tax residency is really important, given that it can mean, as I said, worldwide tax on all of your assets and income up to the top rate of 47%. However, tax residency can be quite complicated, and with proposed changes to the rules on the horizon, this is a bit of a moving beast at the moment. So firstly, I must emphasise that the right to abode, such as permanent residency or citizenship, which you may be looking at, is not the same as tax residency. So if you apply to obtain your PR while you're overseas, this is not going to trigger any Australian tax implications on its own. In fact, it may mean more favourable tax treatment in the instance of stamp duty if you want to purchase property in Australia, or other advantages such as borrowing too. So here, firstly, I'll run through what the current rules or tests that the Australian Tax Office apply to consider who is a tax resident of Australia. So there are 4 tests essentially to determine your tax residency, which is the resides test, the domicile test, the 183-day test, and the Commonwealth Superannuation test. So these tests are required to be performed in descending order until one is satisfied or not, to determine whether you're an Australian tax resident. So the first one here at the top, it's the resides test, and it's essentially the primary tax residency test that's applied by the ATO. So basically, I guess by ordinary concepts, if you reside in Australia, so you're living in Australia, either your physical presence, you're there for an extended period of time, or you're there permanently, your intention and purpose is to live in Australia as well. Things that can also be looked at, such as your family. So if your family is in Australia, significant business or employment ties, assets, if you've got considerable assets in Australia, and also just your social and living arrangements. All of these can be considered by the ATO to determine whether you are in fact living or residing in Australia, which will mean that you're obviously an Australian tax resident. So if you don't satisfy the resides test, you'll still need to consider the other 3 tests. The next one is the domicile test, or permanent place of abode. So if you're an Australian resident, that's the place of your permanent home. It's essentially, I guess, looking at the domicile where of your origin. So for one, if you're born in Australia, that's your domicile, or in fact by choice. So you've moved to Australia and your intention is for Australia to be your new home. That's what's looked at there, and will assess you as an Australian tax resident. Then there's also a little bit more straightforward tests, about basic 183-day tests. So if you're quite simply in Australia for any 1 year for more than 183 days, this is cumulative, with or without breaks, you'll be an Australian tax resident. And then finally, just the Commonwealth superannuation test. So basically, if you're a part of the listed Australian government employee superannuation schemes, you'll be considered an Australian tax resident if you're posted overseas, for instance. So these current rules are essentially based on your intention to move to or back to Australia for expats to be determined as a tax resident. Now, there are new proposals in the pipeline right now. They were introduced to Parliament in 2020. They're yet to be legislated and are currently subject to much scrutiny and objection, particularly by Australian expatriates outside of Australia, where it's intended, I guess the intention here by the ATO is to eliminate a lot of this grey area of intention, particularly with the resides test and the domicile test. There's a lot of private rulings that people get, and I guess the ATO is looking to introduce more of a bright line, clear-cut test or tests to determine tax residency. So the primary test is the factor test, which applies to individuals who spend more than 45 days, but less than 183 days in an income year. And the secondary test focuses on that 45 days. If you're more than 45 days, it then reverts to whether you meet 2 of the 4 factor tests below. So the right to reside, which is citizenship or PR, the ability to access accommodation in Australia, so rights of ownership, leasehold interest licenses, whether the individual's family is in Australia as well, so spouse or children under the 18, and the individual's economic connection, so employment, businesses, interest in Australian investments as well, particularly property. So these tests are yet to be introduced, but there is a lot of talk on these. We'll be monitoring the budget coming up in October. It will likely be spoken about there. So follow us for more details on this, but certainly something to be more aware of. So going into some of the details around some of the strategies. So discussing the tax treatment and strategies available, particularly for real estate, which a lot of people are interested in. And then secondly, how to mitigate some of these tax obligations through several different effective financial strategies. So I'll speak to some of the common strategies here and moving along. So firstly, a few points to keep in mind if you own Australian property. Potentially you can save a lot of tax here by just being in the know. So firstly, really important, obviously, as I mentioned, to understand your tax residency. Be mindful of the rules when you become an Australian tax resident, particularly if you're spending time in Australia, even if you're not a tax resident right now. And also looking at managing property as well. So I guess trying to avoid selling any Australian property while you're a non-resident for Australian tax purposes. Basically, you'll miss out on the CGT exemption for a home or principal residence. Also, no discounting to capital gains applies for a non-resident as well. And also, which I'll speak to in a moment, the tax rates can be higher as well. The 6-year rule on homes and CGT for Australian citizens and permanent residents. So basically, you can sell your principal residence or home tax-free as an Australian tax resident. However, you're not eligible to claim this exemption as a non-resident for tax purposes. So after moving to Australia or being deemed a tax resident, you may then be able to claim the 6-year exemption if you sell your previous home. And this actually also applies for overseas homes. So your current overseas home, moving to Australia, you may rent for a period of time and then sell this property after. Being PR citizen, you can look to, and obviously an Australian tax resident at the time of sale, you can look to claim this 6-year exemption rule on capital gains tax. Discounting on CGT as well. So investments held for more than 12 months typically receive a 50% discount on CGT during the time that you are an Australian tax resident, if you are crystallising and selling this or crystallising this gain while you're an Australian tax resident. So again, just to keep in mind around some of the timing to manage some of this capital gains tax potentially. Maximising deductions, obviously, and carry forward tax credits and losses, which is a big one. Negative gearing costs on Australian property that are not used and are accumulated while you're offshore can actually be used to offset Australian taxable income and capital gains tax later on. So in the next slide, I'll just talk to that a little bit more. So firstly, as mentioned, you can sell your home fully exempt from any capital gains tax as an Australian tax resident, and selling an investment property that's been owned for more than 12 months will be taxed at Australian marginal tax rates as well, although you can receive that 50% discount to capital gains. Rental income is taxed at marginal tax rates as well. So this is as an Australian tax resident. For non-residents for tax purposes, so for non-residents, shares, other assets that may not be taxed by the ATO. On the other hand, Australian real estate and property is taxable in Australia, even as a non-resident for tax purposes. So something to be very mindful of for investors. For Australian expats, this can also include your home in Australia if you sell it while a non-resident, because you won't get that exemption for your home while you're a non-resident. So again, just be mindful of that. You also won't be eligible for any CGT discounting as well. So just a few sort of things to be mindful of in that regard. So with the differences in Australian marginal tax rates and non-resident rates here below, basically the non-resident rates you can see just start at the higher tax bracket. So often it's not a good outcome, receiving rental income at this higher tax bracket. So in regards to, I guess, some of the strategies, there are several levels of borrowing or gearing, which each have their own strategy. So firstly, positive gearing. This is essentially where the rental income is more than the cost of the borrowing and other expenses. This is great because you enjoy the income. However, it will be taxed at either of the below tax rates here. Secondly, you have, net neutral gearing. So the strategy here being that the rental income funds ongoing costs evenly. The strategy is essentially that you make a profit at the sale without any impact to your cash flow during this period. However, obviously you have to manage the capital gains, of course, and timing is key here. And then finally, there's negative gearing, which is a pretty common strategy for investors that are offshore and subject to higher non-resident tax rates. So in this method, rental is less than the costs, although the negative credit or the tax loss here can be accrued each year and carried forward to offset income or CGT at a later time. So rather than saving tax on the rental income at the 32.5% tax bracket, you can accumulate these tax credits and utilize these to offset tax potentially at a higher rate. This is if you sell your property or even Australian taxable income including employment income and other taxable income after moving to Australia. So pretty common strategy there, particularly for offshore non-residents. So on to tax efficient wealth creation structures to mitigate tax on asset returns. So keeping in mind here that as an Australian tax resident, your assets worldwide are taxed, and with common reporting standards these days, there really is nowhere to hide assets anymore. So it is important to think about this. Superannuation is the retirement scheme in Australia. It's much like MPF in Hong Kong, CPF in Singapore, and so on. Although superannuation, it has its own tax environment. It's basically sheltered from Australian marginal tax rates, much like a trust. So superannuation tax rates are basically the maximum is 15%. And you also get a discount on capital gains, reducing CGT down to 10%. So obviously quite a differential between the top marginal tax rate of 47% personally. So superannuation, it's great if you're approaching retirement. However, there's contribution caps to be mindful of. So you typically do need to plan ahead. Concessional contributions or tax deductible contributions, the maximum you can do to superannuation each year is 27,500 Aussie. So it's not a lot, but it is quite a tax effective strategy to utilize year on year. You can consider using this moving forward. Non-concessional contributions are after tax contributions and can allow a larger amount of cash or assets, even property in some instances, to be invested in this more tax effective environment after becoming an Australian tax resident. Here, there is a maximum limit of 110,000 per year, but with the ability to do 3 years in one go. So between a husband or wife, partner, you can move a fair bit of wealth into superannuation pretty quickly. And then in pension phase, essentially you can withdraw from these assets after age 60 and retirement, which is essentially a tax-free income. And also the capital gains and returns on all these assets and investments within superannuation are completely tax-free as well. So this is pretty common strategy, probably the most common strategy, particularly for Australian tax residents, to build up your superannuation. Although there is a maximum level cap of currently 1.7 million for superannuation. So offshore residents can often look at other strategies available as well. So the first one here is portfolio bonds. Essentially, these are an insurance wrapper product with concessional tax treatment with the ATO, subject to guidelines. So these are, if set up correctly, quite low cost, typically for liquid investment assets, and are subject to the 125% contribution rule, which basically means you can make up to 125% of the immediate previous year's contribution. A bit of a weird one, but a pretty clear guidance, and this is how you access a tax effectability. But essentially, all taxes deferred within these products, and completely CGT free after 10 years on any withdrawals. So quite an effective strategy for anyone that is, I guess, more than 10 years away from age 60 and retirement and accessing superannuation, or who may potentially max out their top level cap on super. And then the other one is foreign super. So essentially it's offshore foreign trust, which meets foreign superannuation definition, again with the ATO. Open architecture, which basically means almost any assets can be transferred in, not just restricted to liquid assets. Contributions are uncapped. So high net worth clients, and for large amounts offshore that you can't get into superannuation and may not be suitable for a portfolio bond, is quite useful here. Withdrawals from age 55, so again lower than age 60, which is the access age for Australian super. The initial capital can be withdrawn tax-free, and earnings can be rolled over to Australian superannuation for further tax efficiency as well. So again, this is sort of a more comprehensive open architecture strategy for large amounts to, again, shelter from this worldwide Australian taxation. So I guess just to wrap up here, and mindful of time, often a combination of these strategies being gearing on property, maximising your eligible superannuation contribution strategies, and where appropriate, implementing some of these offshore structures and strategies can really optimise the tax efficiency of your financial situation, and also, improving your wealth creation strategy in this lead up to Australia as well, or moving to Australia. So that's it for me, I think. Yeah, so I guess we'll open it up to questions here. Andre, I think it looks like
okay.
come through.
Yep, thanks, Maddie. Thanks for that comprehensive look on the financial considerations. Again, as Maddie said, very conscious of time. So for the answers that we won't be able to get, we'll definitely get back to you on. But we'll start with a few of them here in, say, the last 5 minutes. So Maddie, there's a question here. Should you consider moving a UK pension saving to an Australian super plan, which is quite a good question. You're on mute, mate.
Yeah, sure. So, yeah, this is a common one. It's not as easy as it used to be. With QROPs now, essentially, you can only move these or access these UK pension savings over the age of 55. So you're pretty limited there anyway. And it's not, you can't necessarily just move it straight to any Australian super fund either, because of the trust deeds for Australian super funds and the ability to wrap up insurance within Australian super. They don't meet QROPs. So essentially you'd have to open up a self-managed super fund, which is definitely doable, although there's higher costs, added complexity, and a few other things to consider. But essentially, if you're over age 55, you could look at an SMSF. But again, it's one of those sort of conversations where you've got to look at added cost, added complexity versus the benefits of doing so. So pretty case by case on that one.
Cool. The next one, Maddie, is as a new resident, can you use superannuation catch-up concessional contributions for prior 5 years before you can become a resident? I guess he's talking about the limits, the 5-year prior limits that you'll be using.
Yeah, so you can, in short. So if you were eligible for superannuation, so basically, you've got to be PR and have the tax file number. And if you're eligible for having superannuation, these concessional contributions, the tax deductible contributions, the 27,500, basically any of this cap that is unused as far back as 2019, you can essentially bring forward and use in any 1 year. So it's a really good point to bring up, and it's really common strategy or useful strategy for people moving to Australia and you're on that higher tax bracket. You can actually go back and use some of the previous year's unused caps to make a larger concessional contribution any 1 year that's over and above the annual 27,500 limit. Again, a really good one for capital gains as well if you do happen to sell a property while you're offshore. And your balance needs to be below 500,000 as well. Just a caveat there.
Okay, just the last two very quickly, Maddie, both involved in relating to investment property. The first one really is with regards to owning an investment property greater than 10 years, classify that as a principal residence, I guess moving into it, and then sell it immediately and take advantage of the downsizer policy to put into super.
Can you move an investment property owned for greater than 10 years? So yeah, basically it's just asking if you can sell it and take advantage of the downsizer contribution policy. Yeah. So again, legislation changed there, bringing that date down to 60. And yeah, there's, as long as it can be meeting that principal residence test, you can make this downsizer contribution.
That's good.
superannuation.
Yep. And the last one, thank you very patience, Nick. It's with regards to having a property in Australia while you're non-resident, but you sell it once you become a resident. Are you entitled to the 12-month CGT discount?
So if you own an investment property in Australia whilst non-resident and sell it as a resident. So yeah, good question. Basically, the period that you're a non-resident, you won't be able to claim the discounting for that period. But from the date you become a non-resident, after 12 months, the gains from that period of time will be or can be subject to that 50% CGT discount. So again, that's why it's really important to get valuations, particularly on property, around that date that you're becoming an Australian tax resident.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Jennifer. And Jen, I noticed that you also answered a few of the questions live as well. So really appreciate that. So guys, everyone, thank you very much for your time. We've gone a bit over time, but I think you agree with me. That's a lot of valuable information there. We will be in touch with you with regards to some follow-ups and if you have any further questions. So again, thank you very much for your time this afternoon, Jennifer, Matthew, and also for everyone attending. Hope you have a great day and we'll be in touch soon. Thank you.
Thank you.